We've all had that moment, where we're reading a book or watching a movie or honestly just like scrolling through the news and we hit a story so undeniably horrific, so steeped in malice or senseless tragedy that our brain just kind of short circuits.
Yeah, it just stops processing.
Exactly. We want the world to operate like a perfectly engineered bridge, every beam bearing the exact weight it's supposed to, every rivet in its logical place, making visible structural sense. But then you watch the evening news for 5 minutes and that pristine model just detonates.
Completely falls apart.
Right. There is rubble everywhere. And the immediate, unavoidable question that rises from that rubble is, if there is an architect, where on earth was he when the building collapsed?
Right. It's the ultimate defining question of human existence. It really is. It's the problem of evil. And it's not just a puzzle for like late-night dorm room debates. The sources we're looking at today argue that if you've ever stood in a hospital room or at a graveside or witnessed profound systemic injustice, you have felt the crushing weight of this dilemma. It's intensely personal for all of us.
It is. And welcome to Reform Thinking. Today, our mission in this deep dive is to explore how a specific theological framework attempts to answer that exact question.
Yeah, the really hard question.
Right. If we assume the premise that God is entirely all-powerful and simultaneously entirely all-loving, how do we account for the sheer volume of suffering, betrayal, and malice in the world? And we are looking at a stack of sources today that tackle this not through some abstract ivory tower philosophy, but by looking at concrete historical narratives from the Bible.
Which I love because it grounds it in reality, right?
Exactly. Specifically, we're going to be exploring the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis and then the Apostle Peter's Pentecost sermon in the book of Acts.
And what stands out immediately in these documents is their absolute refusal to flinch. The authors present a uniquely reformed view that essentially draws a line in the sand. This perspective, it totally refuses to diminish God's absolute sovereignty just to protect his, public relations image.
Right. They don't try to let him off the hook.
Exactly. But it also completely refuses to erase human responsibility. It insists on holding those two massive, seemingly contradictory realities together in the exact same space.
Which, it sounds like a logical impossibility. Like, how can the worst, most devastating evils in human history be simultaneously the wicked, culpable acts of human beings and the perfect, preordained decrees of God?
That's a paradox for sure.
Our sources argue that they are both, though, and we're going to spend this deep dive unpacking the actual mechanics of how that is supposed to work. So let's start with the philosophical dilemma itself. Can you set the table for us?
Yeah, let's start there. So the foundation of this entire discussion rests on the classic trilemma of evil. Skeptics, philosophers, theologians, they've all wrestled with this for centuries. It famously traces back to the Greek philosopher Epicurus.
Oh, right. The Epicurean paradox.
Right, exactly. And the logic is essentially a three-legged stool. Like 1, if God is truly all-powerful, he possesses the ability to prevent evil. Like 2, if God is truly all-loving, he would naturally desire to prevent evil.
Makes sense so far.
But then, like 3, evil undeniably exists in the world. Therefore, the argument concludes, a God who is both all-powerful and all-loving cannot logically exist. And modern critiques of religion frequently leverage this not just as a sterile logical puzzle, but as a really devastating emotional critique of faith.
And it's a very heavy accusation, and I think it's one that resonates with a lot of people. When you look at the sheer brutality of human history, that trilemma, it feels like an airtight case.
It really does on the surface.
But what our sources point out, which I found totally fascinating, is how much of modern mainstream theology actually retreats when faced with this argument.
Oh, massive retreat.
Instead of challenging the premise, there's this widespread tendency to just back away and try to shield God from the accusation by essentially giving up one of the legs of that stool.
Yeah, the texts detail several specific ways this retreat happens in modern religious thought. For instance, they discuss how certain frameworks, like Arminianism, lean really heavily into the concept of autonomous human free will.
Right.
In an attempt to distance God from evil, this view effectively limits God's overriding decree. It presents a paradigm where God passively permits human wickedness just to preserve human freedom.
So he's kind of stepping back.
Right. It paints a picture of a God who is deeply grieved by the state of the world, maybe wringing his hands in heaven, hoping humanity eventually chooses the right path. But he deliberately limits his own power to intervene.
Which almost feels like putting God in the role of a concerned parent who has totally lost control of the household, right? Like, He's watching the kids wreck the living room, but refuses to take away their free choice to break the lamps.
That's actually a great way to put it. And the sources go even further, mentioning open theism, which is a fascinating, if pretty controversial, concept.
Oh, man. Yeah, open theism. This one strips God of exhaustive foreknowledge entirely, doesn't it?
Yes, the documents highlight open theism as an even more radical retreat. In this view, God is reduced to a finite, reactive observer. Because humans have ultimate free will, the future is fundamentally unknowable, like even to God.
So he's just guessing like the rest of us.
Basically. So the Almighty is portrayed as a cosmic chess player, constantly calculating and, adapting his strategy on the fly based on the unpredictable, spontaneous choices of human beings.
Which sounds exhausting, honestly. And the sources also touch on process theology and dualism. In those models, God is either evolving along with the universe, learning and suffering right alongside us, or he is locked in a cosmic, seemingly equal struggle with a dark force.
Right, like a yin and yang kind of thing.
Exactly. And his ultimate victory isn't actually a foregone conclusion. The author of our main text argues that all of these systems are essentially desperate bids to preserve God's moral reputation, but they do it by stripping him of his absolute power.
But the critical analysis offered by our sources is that diminishing God's sovereignty doesn't actually solve the problem of evil at all.
Really? How so?
Well, it just leaves you with a weakened deity.
Uh-huh.
If God cannot sovereignly control evil, if it operates outside his jurisdiction, or constantly surprises him, how can he guarantee any sort of final victory over darkness?
Oh, I see.
Like, how can he guarantee justice will finally be served, or that salvation is actually secure?
If he doesn't control the board, he can't promise a checkmate.
Exactly. So the Reformed confessional stance takes a completely different and arguably much more daring approach.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the text references the traditional Reformed confessions here, and it does not back down. It boldly asserts that God ordains whatsoever comes to pass, everything. But the caveat is super crucial. It claims he does so without being the author of sin, without doing violence to the human will, and without taking away the contingency of secondary causes.
That right there, that is the theological tightrope. It's the assertion that God's absolute sovereignty and human moral responsibility are not mutually exclusive. They are, in fact, totally compatible.
Okay, let me test an analogy here, because ordaining whatsoever comes to pass without being the author of sin, that is a dense concept.
Very dense. Let's hear it.
Okay, think of an author writing a massive epic novel. The author dictates the entire plot from the first page to the last. Now, in chapter 4, there is a villain who commits a terrible, malicious betrayal. Within the universe of the story, that villain is acting on his own dark desires. He makes his own choices, he is truly guilty of malice, and he is fully responsible for the pain he causes the other characters. But the author sitting at the typewriter isn't guilty of a crime.
Right.
The author is utilizing that dark chapter, that specific betrayal, to construct an overarching narrative of redemption and ultimate justice. So the author is sovereign over the story, but the character remains entirely responsible for the sin.
I like that. That framing aligns perfectly with the Reformed view presented in the text. The author's intention in writing the villain's action is fundamentally different from the villain's intention in committing the action.
Different intentions, same action.
Yes. The character's intention is destructive, but the author's intention is narrative perfection.
Yeah.
The burning question, though, is how we map this author and character dynamic onto actual historical reality. Because theoretical analogies are fine, but how does this framework hold up in the gritty, devastating reality of actual human existence?
Right, because we aren't ink on a page. We're real people who bleed and suffer.
Exactly.
So to see the framework in action, our sources point us back to the Late Bronze Age. We are looking at what the text calls the foundational blueprint for this entire theological concept. And we find this in the book of Genesis, chapter 50.
Yeah, this is the culmination of the story of Joseph.
Right. And the historical and narrative stage here is so vital for understanding the argument. We are situated in the patriarchal era. The geography of the biblical narrative has shifted from the rocky ancestral hills of Canaan down to the incredibly fertile delta of Lower Egypt.
And Joseph has just lived through an unbelievable, highly traumatic trajectory.
Traumatic is an understatement, honestly. I mean, he was hated by his older brothers, betrayed, thrown into a pit to die, eventually sold to Midianite traders as a slave.
And taken to a foreign country.
Yeah. falsely accused of sexual assault by his master's wife, and then thrown into an Egyptian dungeon where he languished for years.
It's just wave after wave of intense suffering. Yet the narrative arc shows that through what the text identifies as divine providence, Joseph is eventually pulled from that dungeon and elevated to the position of vizier, second only to Pharaoh himself.
Quite the promotion.
Huge promotion. And he is tasked with navigating the ancient Egyptian empire through a devastating 7-year global famine. And through his administrative brilliance, he ends up preserving his entire estranged family, the 70 souls of the house of Jacob, who migrate to the land of Goshen to survive.
And the texts emphasize that we cannot view this as just like a random series of unfortunate events that luckily culminated in a happy ending.
No, not at all.
The author ties this entire sequence of betrayal and political maneuvering directly back to the Abrahamic covenant.
That's a pivotal connection. It's so important. Decades prior, in Genesis chapter 15, the text records a covenant between God and Abraham, which includes a highly specific, chilling prophecy regarding the historical trajectory of Abraham's descendants.
God actually tells him what's going to happen.
He does. God tells Abraham that his offspring will be sojourners in a foreign land, that they will be servants there, and that they will be afflicted for 400 years.
Wow. 400 yems. So according to the sources, the presence of the patriarchal family in Egypt wasn't an accidental detour caused by a famine.
Right.
It was a divine forewarning being executed in history. The betrayal at the pit, the slavery, the false accusations, the framework views all of it as the intricate mechanism God used to position the seed of Abraham precisely where they needed to be to survive the famine and eventually multiply into a nation.
Which brings us to the immediate psychological crisis in Genesis chapter 50.
Yeah, because things are about to get very tense.
Very. The famine has passed, the family has settled, but then Jacob, the patriarch and father, dies. And the moment he dies, the text describes Joseph's brothers descending into absolute panic.
And the psychology of the brothers here it's fascinating. For decades, at least 22 years, they have been carrying the agonizing, suffocating guilt of what they did to their younger brother.
Yeah, that kind of secret doesn't just go away.
No, they literally threw their own flesh and blood into a hole in the ground, ignored his pleas for mercy, and sold him for the price of a crippled slave. Even though Joseph had already revealed his identity to them and provided food for their families, that underlying terror never actually went away.
The author notes that unconfessed or unresolved sin produces an enduring torment of guilt. The brothers project their own fallen, vindictive standards onto Joseph. In their minds, they assume he operates exactly the way they would operate.
Right, they assume he's just as petty as they are.
Exactly. They assume that human vengeance is inevitable and that Joseph has simply been biding his time, waiting for their father to pass away so he could execute a brutal retaliation without breaking the old man's heart.
They are so utterly convinced of this impending doom that they actually fabricate a story. They send a messenger to Joseph, claiming that before he died, their father gave a specific mandate. Please forgive the transgression of your brothers. Which, is probably a total lie.
Almost certainly a lie.
And then, in this striking narrative moment, they physically arrive, throw themselves on the ground before him, and beg to be his slaves.
The irony there is profound if you think about it. By throwing themselves on the ground as slaves, they are acting out the exact fulfillment of Joseph's childhood dreams from Genesis 37.
Oh, the dreams with the sheaves of wheat bowing down.
Yes, the very dreams of dominance that provoked their jealousy and caused them to sell him into slavery in the first place.
Wow.
But returning to the core theological problem, the brothers' actions were undeniably rooted in pure malice. They were acting out of greed, jealousy, and hatred.
Right, and let me pause you right there, because this is the pushback I think any listener would have at this exact moment.
Okay, let's hear it.
If their action was pure human greed, where is God in that specific brutal moment at the pit? Does God just wait for them to do something horrible and then step in afterward to clean up the mess and try to salvage a good outcome?
That's the core question, and the text argues forcefully against that cleanup view. The answer to how the Reformed framework handles this lies in a single, brilliantly utilized Hebrew verb in Joseph's response.
Ooh, grammar time.
Yeah. So when his brothers are weeping on the floor, Joseph says, "Am I in the place of God?" He immediately disavows any right to personal vengeance, recognizing a higher jurisdiction. And then he delivers what the sources consider the most concise statement of compatibilism in all of Scripture. Genesis 50.2, he says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good."
You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. That gives me chills. The author of our main source does a massive deep dive into the grammar of providence here, specifically focusing on the Hebrew word translated as meant.
The word is chashav, and it is a remarkably rich, multi-layered theological term in biblical Hebrew. It translates to calculating, reckoning, imputing, or weaving a complex plan.
Weaving, I like that.
Yeah, it's actually the same root word used elsewhere in the Old Testament to describe the skill of master craftsmen weaving intricate, multicolored tapestries for the tabernacle. The linguistic choice made by Moses, who is the traditional author of Genesis, is deeply intentional here.
And the sources point out the words Moses deliberately did not use, which I think is just as important. He didn't use a word that just means to, like, plot something in your imagination, nor did he use a word that means to physically build or manufacture.
Right.
And he certainly didn't use the word bara, which is the theological term used in Genesis 1 for creating something out of absolutely nothing.
Precisely. Moses used chashav for both the human action and the divine action, structurally binding them together in the exact same sentence.
At the exact same time.
Yes. The brothers calculated and wove a tapestry of intrinsic moral evil. The Hebrew word used there is raw. They wove that against Joseph. Their intention was purely malicious. They wanted him dead or gone. But simultaneously, not chronologically later, God calculated and wove that exact same historical sequence of events for ultimate good. The Hebrew word latova.
So going back to the tapestry idea, I always thought of it like this. Imagine a massive loom. The brothers are standing on the backside of the tapestry. They are frantically tying these dark, ugly, jagged knots. They are weaving with threads of jealousy, hatred, and greed, and they are completely unaware of what the final product looks like.
They just see the mess.
Right. But the framework argues that God is standing on the front side of that exact same tapestry. He isn't stopping them from tying the knots. Rather, he is sovereignly taking those exact same dark threads, those exact same malicious actions, and incorporating them to weave a breathtakingly beautiful picture of salvation on the front.
That visualization captures the essence of concurrence perfectly. God did not inject evil into the brothers' hearts. He did not force them to be jealous.
They did that all on their own.
Exactly. But he sovereignly directed their freely chosen, deeply flawed actions to accomplish his righteous decree. And the text highlights a specific purpose clause at the end of that verse, utilizing the Hebrew word lahakayo.
Lahakio, what does that mean?
It means to cause to live or to preserve alive a great multitude. God's sovereign calculation over human evil causally resulted in the physical salvation of the ancient Near East during the famine.
That is incredible. So the moral character of the action is entirely defined by the intention of the agent. The brothers intended destruction. God intended preservation.
Exactly. Intention is everything.
But the author makes it clear that this Old Testament story of physical preservation in Egypt is just a shadow. It's a precursor, an archetype, to something vastly more significant. The ultimate antitype of this divine weaving doesn't happen in a throne room in Egypt. It happens centuries later on a Roman cross outside Jerusalem.
Yeah, if Genesis 50 is the architectural blueprint, the sources argue that Acts chapter 2 is the towering cathedral built upon it.
The stakes get so much higher.
Infinitely higher. To understand this, we have to transition to the literary and socio-political context of the New Testament. The setting is the Feast of Pentecost in Jerusalem. Jesus of Nazareth has recently been crucified under the authority of Pontius Pilate.
And we really shouldn't gloss over what crucifixion meant in that era. Like, we wear crosses as jewelry today, but back then it wasn't just a method of execution. It was a deeply shameful, excruciatingly public Roman torture device. It was literally designed to strip the victim of all dignity and serve as a brutal deterrent to rebellion.
It was state-sponsored terrorism.
Yes, the ultimate display of imperial malice.
And in the aftermath of that intense trauma, the disciples claimed to have received the Holy Spirit. And Peter, who notoriously denied even knowing Jesus just weeks prior, he stands up to preach to an international crowd of thousands gathered in the city. The sources break down Peter's resulting sermon into 4 distinct exegetical movements that mirror that Joseph's dynamic, but like you said, escalate the stakes infinitely.
So let's go through those movements.
Right.
The author outlines the first movement as divine attestation.
Right.
Peter starts by declaring that God publicly authenticated Jesus through mighty works, wonders, and signs. He's establishing that Jesus wasn't some obscure, hidden philosopher. Yeah. God put a very public, undeniable stamp of approval on his ministry.
That sets the foundation. Then the second movement is divine determination. Peter announces that the same Jesus was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God.
Wait, definite plan?
Yes. The Greek phrasing there implies a determined, unalterable appointed counsel. The text insists that the cross was not a tragic accident, a failure of the movement, or, a frantic backup plan instituted after humanity rejected the Messiah.
It was plan A all along.
It was the only plan.
Wow. Then comes the third movement, which the source describes as the sharp edge of the blade, human culpability. Peter looks directly at this massive crowd in Jerusalem and says, "You crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men."
He points the finger right at them.
He does. And finally, the fourth movement, divine resurrection. God raised him up.
The moral weight of this sermon, if you situate yourself as a listener in that first century crowd, it is staggering. Peter directly, unequivocally indicts them for murder.
He doesn't hold back.
No. He does not allow God's overarching sovereignty to function as an excuse or a get-out-of-jail-free card for human guilt. The crowd cannot shrug and say, well, if God planned it from the foundation of the world, we are innocent. We were just playing our parts.
Right. You can't blame the author of the book for the villain's choices.
Exactly. Peter insists they acted willingly, through their own lawless intentions, and they bear the absolute moral responsibility for the blood on their hands.
And the vocabulary the author focuses on here is incredibly precise. The text zeroes in on Peter's use of the Greek words boulo, which means a definite plan, purpose, or counsel, and prognosis, which translates to foreknowledge.
Oh, and this is a massive point of contention in theological circles.
Right, because foreknowledge sounds like just looking into the future, right?
And that's how many interpret it. But the sources argue vehemently that in the biblical worldview, foreknowledge is not merely passive foresight.
Yeah, the framework utterly rejects the idea of God looking through some sort of cosmic time portal, passively observing what Judas Iscariot, the Sanhedrin, and Pontius Pilate are going to freely choose to do, and then hastily adapting his divine plans to incorporate those foreseen events.
Because if it's just passive foresight, we're right back to the open theism or Arminian idea of God reacting to us.
The chess player who's just constantly playing defense.
Exactly. The text asserts that divine foreknowledge is deeply covenantal and entirely purposeful. It is predestination. The argument is that God foreknew the events of the cross precisely because God actively decreed the cross as the absolute center of his saving counsel before time even began.
Okay, let me stop you there because the listener is undoubtedly hitting a mental wall at this exact point.
I get it. It's a lot.
If God specifically predestined the brutal, unjust murder of his own son, if he mathematically calculated every betrayal and every hammer strike, doesn't that fundamentally make God the author of that sin? How does this framework possibly untangle God's absolute holiness from the unimaginable raw injustice of a crucifixion?
That, right there, that is the crux of the entire Reformed theodicy. To resolve that tension, the sources argue we must look surgically at who is executing the action and with what specific intention.
Back to intention?
Always back to intention. The text directs us a few chapters later to Acts chapter 4, where the early church is praying under the threat of intense persecution. This prayer provides what the author calls the anatomy of a divine decree.
Okay, let me read the specific passage they highlight because it's pretty striking. This is Acts 4.27-28. For truly, in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place.
The Greek word utilized there is choriza, predestined, or decided beforehand. The text points out the terrifying reality of this verse. You have King Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Roman military apparatus, and the religious leaders of Israel. Historically, these groups despised one another.
They were mortal enemies.
Yes. Yet they formed this massive, unified conspiracy of evil. They gather together in supreme human malice to torture and execute a man they know to be completely innocent.
But the author draws our attention back to the contrast of intentions, just like with Joseph's brothers. Why did the human actors do what they did? The historical and biblical record suggests they acted out of a toxic cocktail of envy, religious unbelief, political expediency, cowardice, and sheer hatred.
Right. Pilate wanted to keep his job. The religious leaders wanted to keep their power.
Exactly. Their intention was to destroy a threat to their power. But why did God act? What was God's intention in predestining this horrific event to take place? The framework argues God acted out of self-giving love and perfect holy justice.
We also have to factor in the Christological element here, which the sources stress is so vital. The narrative does not present Jesus as a helpless, unwilling victim being dragged to the slaughter by an abusive, distant father.
That's a huge misconception.
It is. He is presented as the sinless mediator. He is perfectly voluntarily obeying the Father, actively laying down his life for his sheep.
No one takes his life from him. He lays it down of his own accord.
Exactly. So the reformed answer to the problem of evil, as presented in these texts, is that the moral character of any action is completely inseparable from the agent's ultimate intention. The murderers intended intrinsic evil, but God intended penal substitution.
Penal substitution, that's a heavy theological term.
It is. The text leans on it heavily. God intended for Christ to bear the curse, to absorb the unmitigated fury of divine justice against sin, in order to redeem humanity.
Wow.
The profound claim here is that God doesn't answer the problem of evil from a safe, sterile distance with a philosophical theory.
He doesn't just give us an essay on why evil exists.
No. The framework asserts that he enters the blood, the dirt, and the agony of Golgotha, absorbs the maximum penalty of evil into himself, and thereby turns the greatest, most unjust crime in the history of the cosmos into the literal fountain of eternal life.
To summarize the author's synthesis here, because this is so incredibly profound, God ordains whatsoever comes to pass without ever sinning. Creatures act freely according to their own fallen natures without ever escaping moral responsibility. And perhaps most importantly for you, the listener, redemption advances through the dark, painful providences of life, not by magically bypassing them.
It's a robust framework.
Mhm.
It really holds up, but the sources are quick to point out a massive caveat.
Okay, what's the caveat?
If the historical narrative simply stopped on Good Friday evening, with Jesus dead in a tomb, evil would still appear to have the final, definitive word.
Right. It would look like a tragic defeat.
Exactly. It would look like political violence, betrayal, and darkness successfully crushed the ultimate manifestation of righteousness. The author argues that the cornerstone of this entire Reformed theodicy, the element that keeps it from collapsing into pure fatalism, is what the narrative claims happened on Sunday morning.
Which transitions us to the empty tomb. Going back to Peter's sermon in Acts 2, he declares that God raised Jesus up, loosing the pains of death because it was not possible for him to be held by it.
The resurrection changes the entire theological horizon. Without it, death's apparent victory on Friday is terminal. But the resurrection, the text argues, vindicates Jesus as the Christ. It serves as the Father's public confirmation that the atonement was successful and accepted.
The check cleared, so to speak.
The check cleared. Furthermore, it inaugurates the promise of a new creation. The author makes a compelling point. If you remove the resurrection from the equation, divine providence is nothing more than a dark, crushing mechanism, and humanity is just a collection of cogs in a fatalistic machine.
Just grinding us down into dust.
Yeah. But with the resurrection, providence is transformed into the wise, loving government of living Lord who has demonstrably conquered death.
What I found genuinely surprising in the sources is how they tether this New Testament concept of resurrection all the way back to the very end of the Genesis narrative. The author draws a line from the empty tomb straight back to Joseph's deathbed in Genesis 50.
It's a brilliant literary and theological connection, isn't it?
It really is. So in verses 24 through 26, Joseph is dying in Egypt. He gathers his brothers and delivers this incredible prophecy. He says, "I'm about to die, but God will surely visit you and bring you up out of this land, to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." And then he makes them swear an oath that when God finally delivers them, they will carry his bones up out of Egypt.
And the linguistic deep dive here is fascinating. The text points out that Joseph is embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. But the Hebrew word Moses uses for coffin is Aaron.
Aaron. Okay, why is that significant?
Well, Aaron is the exact same Hebrew word used extensively throughout the rest of the Torah to describe the Ark of the Covenant.
The Ark of the Covenant, really?
Yes. It is a word loaded with immense theological significance regarding God's presence and his promises.
Wow. And the author suggests that Joseph's unburied coffin stood in the land of Goshen in Egypt for roughly 400 years.
4 centuries, just sitting there.
Just sitting there. It functioned as a visible, physical monument of covenant faithfulness. It was a tangible reminder to a severely traumatized, enslaved nation that their brutal exile was temporary and that God's sovereign, overarching promise of redemption would inexorably be fulfilled no matter how oppressive the current regime felt.
If you put yourself in the sandals of an Israelite slave during that 400-year period, the psychological impact of that object is profound. You're enduring back-breaking labor, systemic oppression, perhaps even state-sponsored violence. But you look over and you see this ancient wooden coffin.
Which normally would just be depressing.
Right. To the naked eye, a coffin is the ultimate symbol of death. It represents a dead end, a failed dream. But because of the specific promise attached to it, that coffin was actually an ironclad guarantee of life. It was a physical marker that said, we are not staying here. This darkness is not the end of our story.
And the framework argues that this is exactly how the believer is instructed to view the cross of Jesus Christ.
The exact same way.
To the Romans, it was an instrument of terror and death. But to the believer, it is the ultimate guarantee of life.
It's a total perspective shift. The empty tomb stands, much like Joseph's coffin, as an absolute guarantee that evil, suffering, and malice have no final, lasting kingdom over humanity. The author concludes that the cross and the empty tomb must become the primary lenses through which we view and interpret all of history, both global and personal.
Which naturally leads us to the most practical and perhaps the most difficult part of this deep dive. Theology is great, understanding the Bronze Age and first century Greek is great, but how does this massive cosmic framework actually change the way a person operates on a Tuesday morning?
That's where the rubber meets the road.
Exactly. When you lose your job, when you face a terrifying medical diagnosis, or when a friend deeply betrays you, how does this Reformed doctrine of providence apply in that moment? The author spends considerable time discussing the pastoral comfort and the call to obedience that supposedly flows from these texts.
Yeah, and the application begins with a rigorous defense against what the author considers false, damaging theology. The text explicitly refutes frameworks like the prosperity gospel, which falsely promises that genuine faith guarantees an exemption from earthly suffering.
Right. The logic of the prosperity gospel suggests that if you just believe hard enough or, pray the exact right way, you will be shielded from illness and financial ruin.
The author calls that a devastating lie and points right back to the biblical text we just reviewed. Joseph was demonstrably righteous, yet he spent his prime years rotting in a dungeon. Jesus was perfectly sinless, yet he was tortured and crucified. The framework insists that God's favor does not equate to a pain-free existence.
And the sources also target a modern tendency toward mysticism or pragmatism.
Oh, this one is huge.
It's this constant frantic search for private, secret revelations to explain every single tragedy in our lives. The author notes that many people, when faced with sudden suffering, exhaust themselves trying to read the proverbial tea leaves, trying to decipher exactly why a specific disaster occurred.
It's the instinct to say, I got a flat tire on the way to the interview because God is trying to tell me I shouldn't take the job. Or trying to find a hidden spiritual meaning behind a completely random accident.
Right, connecting dots that aren't actually there.
Exactly. The text argues that Scripture gives absolutely no warrant for inventing secret, personalized messages from God about particular earthly disasters. We simply aren't privy to the back of the tapestry.
We only see our little knot on the back.
Right. Instead of demanding secret knowledge, the framework demands radical obedience, starting with the agonizing command to forgive.
Oh, man. Forgiveness.
Yeah. The author uses Joseph as the prime example here. Joseph's ability to look into the eyes of the brothers who literally destroyed his youth and truly offer them forgiveness was not born out of some naive, overly optimistic view of humanity.
He wasn't just a nice guy.
No, it came directly from his rock-solid belief in God's absolute sovereignty. The text argues that when we stubbornly refuse to forgive someone who has wronged us, we are functionally usurping the judge's seat. We are silently declaring that our demand for vengeance is superior to God's administration of ultimate justice.
That is a tough pill to swallow. But I appreciate that the sources don't veer into toxic positivity either. They make it abundantly clear that resting in God's providence doesn't mean you just, slap a smile on your face and pretend a tragedy is actually wonderful.
No, not at all.
The text highlights the biblical mandate for faithful lament. It points to the Psalms, which are filled with people pouring out raw, unedited grief, screaming at the heavens, asking God, how long will you let the wicked prosper?
It's a vital pastoral distinction. The framework allows believers to name wickedness truthfully. You are permitted to seek earthly justice in the courts. You are not required to pretend that emotional or physical pain is pleasant. The author emphatically states that providence does not sanitize sin.
Sin is still sin.
Evil is still evil, even if God ultimately uses it for good.
And the author offers a concluding principle for navigating suffering that I found incredibly compelling. The text argues that we must interpret our unknown providences through the known cross, rather than interpreting the cross through our painful providences.
That is huge. The temptation, when walking through a dark trial, is to reason from our subjective experience upward. The human mind says, I am in excruciating pain right now. Therefore, God must be cruel or he must have abandoned me.
Right, we judge God based on our current circumstances.
But the theology presented in the sources demands the exact opposite movement. It points out that at Calvary, the Father's love and saving grace were most hidden from ordinary human sight precisely at the exact moment when the ultimate act of redemption was being accomplished.
The sun literally went dark.
The sun went dark. Therefore, the argument goes, when your present circumstances are incomprehensibly dark, you don't evaluate God's character based on your current pain. You cling to what God has already publicly, historically revealed about his character in the person and work of Christ.
Cling to the cross.
To borrow the author's framing, the intended effect of Peter's sermon at Pentecost was never just to furnish the crowd with a neat intellectual theological framework.
It wasn't an academic lecture.
No. The goal was to produce profound humility, a sharp conviction of guilt, and ultimately repentance. The text suggests that the problem of evil isn't just a philosophical puzzle out there in the broader world. It is a grim reality localized in our own hearts.
Ouch.
The uncomfortable truth of the framework is that we are the rebels. We are the ones tying the dark knots on the back of the tapestry.
Yet the central paradox the sources leave us with is that the God humanity rebelled against is the very one who provides the cure, and he does it by orchestrating the darkest moments of history to achieve it. The text concludes with a reflection on Romans 8.28, a famous passage stating that God works all things together for good for those who love him. And the author clarifies that the verse does not say that all things are intrinsically good.
Right, a betrayal is not good.
A terminal diagnosis is not good. But the sovereign architect uses the rough, agonizing file of earthly trials to shape and polish his people for an ultimate eternal weight of glory.
The sources essentially argue that because God governs the final outcomes, because he holds the pen that writes the end of the story, humanity is free to simply do what is right in the present moment without buckling under the terrifying pressure of having to control the universe.
It gives you permission to just be human.
Yes, it provides a massive theological foundation for enduring the unendurable.
We've covered an immense amount of ground today. We started in the sun-baked dust of the Bronze Age, watching Joseph's brothers calculate a plot of pure malice, throwing him into a pit.
We covered a lot of history.
We did, and then we moved forward thousands of years to the 1st century, analyzing the lawless hands of men conspiring to nail the Son of God to a Roman cross. And through it all, we've explored a framework that claims God remains absolutely sovereign over the tapestry of history without ever being the author of the dark threads, while human beings remain fully morally responsible without ever escaping the boundaries of his divine decree.
It holds both realities perfectly in tension.
It really does. According to the sources, the cross is the ultimate proof that God's providence is holy, and the empty tomb is the absolute proof that evil cannot and will not win.
Amen to that.
As we wrap up this deep dive, the text leaves us with a provocative thought to mull over, and I want to pose it to you. If this framework holds true, if God has already proven in the bedrock of ancient history that he possesses the ability to take the absolute, darkest, most unjust moment in the cosmic story, the murder of his own son, and mathematically, purposefully weave it for ultimate salvation, how does that alter the way you look at the greatest uncertainty, the deepest pain, or the darkest fear currently hanging over your own life?
That's the question we all have to answer.
It really is. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep exploring the sources, keep asking the hard questions, and we will catch you next time.